Welcome back to the YA podcast. My name is Ryan Keaton. I'm your host, and we are several episodes into this podcast. We're here. We're doing it. Yeah. And so today we have special guest Dr. Jake Dorak at First Baptist Manchester. It's here. So Jake is one of our authors in this continuing series that we've been doing over the past several weeks on winning young adults in our Harvest Field book. And so Jake helped us in that in writing chapter 4 that focused on the gospel matters. And so, Jake, welcome.
Oh, thank you, Ryan. I'm Dr. Ryan Keaton. It's good to be here. And thank you guys for having me on. So
Jake, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, your family, your ministry context that you're serving in right now.
Yeah, so I live in Manchester, Tennessee, and I serve at First Baptist Church in Manchester. I'm the associate pastor of missions and evangelism. And so part of my context is in reaching young adults. And so I've been married to Katie for 15 years.
Congratulations.
Yeah. She is amazing, definitely my better half. And then we have 3 children. I have a 9-year-old named Luke, and then I have 2 3-year-olds, Elliot and Caitlin. And so,
twin life.
Yeah, raising twins is a lot of fun. We're finally to where we're sleeping again, so that's a lot of fun. And but yeah, they're great. Love being a dad. Love being married to Katie. And then in church life, it's when you're associate pastor, you wear a lot of hats. And so I do mission trips, young adults, small groups for young adults, and then I'm also the coordinator of the Jesus Tent at Bonnaroo. So we handle that as well, which is a great partnership with the TBMB and other local churches all throughout Tennessee and the surrounding areas. So,
that's awesome. Well, we're excited to dive into this conversation, one that I don't think anybody would argue against in the fact that the gospel matters. I think anyone listening would be like, duh.
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of a given, right?
Yeah, I think, if something's going to matter in this conversation, in this world, germane to this podcast,
probably
it's going to be the gospel.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. You like that word, germane?
I do, yeah. Sounding,
bringing out the vocabulary.
I've been reading. For those who are just listening. But while we know in theory the gospel matters, it's sometimes a little bit harder to put that into context of practice. And when it comes to young adult ministry, maybe in particular, there could be the temptation to try to make your young adult ministry or outreach efforts not as gospel-centered as they should be because of just the secular influence that can impact young adult ministry or young adult life. You think you maybe have to compete with the world. And I think our conversation today will help just see, we will not out-entertain culture, and that's not what young adults want us to do. They want something that the world can't give them, and that is hope through the good news of Jesus that's in the gospel. And so, Jake, as we kind of enter into this, you volunteered to talk about this topic. Some were assigned, some were volunteered for. So why did you specifically pick out of the other chapters to talk about the gospel through the lens of young adult ministry?
Well, because you hit the nail on the head right there where you talked about sometimes we feel like we need to compete with the world, or to be relevant, we've got to kind of water down some things. But the one thing that the church offers that the world cannot is the gospel. So we have to be clear on that, on what that is, because there's a lot of different definitions of what the gospel could be. And so one of the things I try to outline in this chapter, and I think it's very important for us to outline in our ministries, is what is the gospel? And so I just go with what Scripture says in the definition that Paul gives in 1 Corinthians 15 there, that essentially the gospel is Jesus lived, died, was buried, and he rose again. That good news, that news flash, that celebratory statement actually has power to move us from death to life. And if we don't have that in our ministries, then we're missing the one thing that we offer that no one else can offer, right? We're missing the one thing we have. We're missing our supernatural power in our ministry.
For sure. And for us being in Tennessee, and I'm sure some of our listeners can probably relate to this, there is somewhat of the understanding or foundational or maybe a thought that, well, a lot of the young adults in my community, they probably know what we mean when we say gospel or when we talk about gospel accounts. And while some of that may be true, you probably have young adults that have been around Christianity. You kind of lay out, you can be around the gospel, but you can fail to have fluency in the gospel. And I think we're seeing in young adult world, though, there's just people who have no foundation whatsoever when it comes to the gospel. If you were to say the gospel, they may think of music, but they would have no idea what that means anywhere outside of that.
Yeah, it's almost like the gospel is a flavor of coffee or something like that. I want the gospel flavored church or something like that. So if we understand gospel as a worldview and we look at the meta narrative or the big story of Scripture of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration, that's actually a worldview and a lens that we can look at all of life, that will bring in a gospel fluency. So, creation, since God created everything and said it's good, that gives us a theology of our vocation. That gives us a theology of how we take care of the earth. That filters all of life. Same thing with the fall. When bad things happen and we wonder why, it points us back to the story and say, okay, we understand the fall caused the brokenness in our world. But it also gives us the hope of redemption, that Christ came, lived, died, was buried, rose again, and because of that, there's hope, that I'm not stuck here in the end of the story that would be a tragedy, that all is lost, that there's hope of redemption. And then ultimately, it keeps us looking forward to the restoration of all things. I love that C.S. Lewis says that the people who do the most in this life are the people who are thinking the most about the next. So if we have our mind set on earth as it is in heaven, right, and bringing forth that restoration now and not just waiting until Jesus comes back to make everything right, that these are lenses that leads to a fluency in our lives to where we see all of life through the gospel.
So you're in the young adult world. So for our listeners who are maybe trying to wrestle through checking this with other people that they come in contact with, what are some things that you look for in a relationship with a young adult that helps you see they may or may not have gospel fluency?
Yeah, well, I think sometimes with young adults, when you look at the stage of life they're in and they're beating themselves up that they're not further ahead than they think they should, well, then you're looking at them saying, hey, listen, maybe you have this performance worldview of where you're trying to perform in order to be accepted by God and to be loved by Him, not realizing it's already been purchased for you on the cross. And because of that, now you can rest in the gospel, allow Jesus to be Lord, allow Him to be in control, and then He can work through you His purpose and plans, knowing that He's not going to abandon the work, right? He's going to complete it in you. If you don't have a gospel lens and a gospel fluency, you may always be trying to, when I get the job, then I'll be happy. When I marry the girl, then everything will be right. Yeah. When we have the kids or when we get the kids out of the house, right? Then everything will be better. So I think in young adult life, there's always that next thing. When I get to the next thing, it's performance. That's your worldview. Yeah. Well, that's already been settled on the cross, But if you lack that gospel fluency, you're going to miss that, and that's just a deficiency where you're not believing God in what He's already done.
Yeah, and I think in young adult world, and especially with the rise of social media and the availability of bad theology, there's a lot of Christianese sounding things that are just not gospel centered and biblical. I know in my young adult ministry, I had a young lady who feels called to some type of ministry. She's thinking maybe worship ministry or women's ministry or something. And she came to me one night after our Bible study, and she was just almost in tears because somebody had given her the advice that if God was in it, then it would be easy. Yeah. And she was like, well, why has this path been so hard? And I was like, that advice you were given is just not biblical. Because if that was the case, then what was up with Jesus' ministry and the disciples' ministry? And nothing about that looked easy. And so while that sounds good. And if God's in it, it will be easy because, of course, he opens the door and he goes before us and all of those things. Functionally and practically and just theologically, it's not the case. That's just not good, sound advice. So, I mean, it has maybe the outline of the gospel, but it doesn't have the substance of the gospel. And there's so much of that, I think, prevalent in young adult world right now because they're getting their theology from TikTok and they're not getting it from Scripture.
And then on top of that, going back to the flavor, the make my gospel chocolate conversation, I think, especially for somebody like me who grew up in church my whole life, there's this, to say you're Christian, I thought about this a lot. To say you're Christian in America is like saying, to a degree, like saying, I'm a Tennessean. I
live in Tennessee.
I live in Tennessee.
Fan.
Yeah, I'm a Vols fan.
Yeah.
And there's this there can be this disconnect between what I've been taught my whole life versus having a real encounter and an experience and a real understanding of the gospel and understanding of who Jesus is and what he did through the cross and through the work of the cross and resurrecting and all those things. And in my life, what I've found is that the closer that the more that I've sought truth and sought after not putting away things that I've taught, because there were a lot of great foundational truths that are paramount to my life, but at the same time there was a personal thing that I needed to connect to be able to transition my life from just because it is easy to get caught up in the rat race, so to speak.
Right.
You want the wife, you want the career, you want that stability, especially if you had parents that were successful, or you had parents that seem to have had it all together, and you're like, well, why doesn't it seem to be flowing as easily for me as it did for my dad or my mom? When the truth is, it really wasn't really easy for them at all. They were,
Right.
you were shielded from some of those things, and now you're experiencing some of those things. But the fact is that I think getting a personal relationship was one of the main things that just revolutionized my whole life. I'm 33.
Right.
I got saved when I was 8. And over the course of that time, it probably wasn't until I was in my young adult years where I realized, like, oh, okay, I need to know Jesus for myself. I need to know God for myself, and understand what it is that he put in me to do outside of whatever expectations the world may have, or whatever expectations even family or friends or whoever I assign to that space may have for me, so that I can relinquish all of these kind of societal things and pressures that the world may try to put on us.
And what you're describing there is the clash of the worldviews,
Yeah.
right? So the American worldview, right, the American dream versus what Scripture teaches, that just collided there.
Yeah.
And you're saying, okay, at the end of the day, I had to go back to what's true.
Yeah.
And what is the foundations by which God has created this world, and what has he defined as truth, not as what my culture says.
Yeah.
And I think that's really part of, or the crux of really where young adults are, and what this chapter is about is we've got to have a gospel-centered lens by which we look at the world, because we're being discipled all the time, right? And so we're either being discipled by the Word or we're being discipled by the world.
Yeah.
Good and bad, right? Because what you're describing are good things.
Yeah.
Having a job, being financially stable, taking care of you and your family. These are these are not bad things.
Yeah.
But they can be good things that become God things if they get disoriented.
That's right.
And so...
And some of those, you mentioned expectations and those things. We have expectations that I think are put on us from outside sources. We have expectations within ourselves. And Jake, you kind of mentioned some of this in the chapter. You use Luke 24 as kind of the launching pad of that, where you have these guys who had followed Jesus, and it seemed like they had some unmet expectations of Jesus, expecting him to restore the kingdom here on earth and all of these things. And then we see the irony that they actually come face to face with Jesus in the flesh, and they don't realize it's him.
Yeah.
And so what do you think are some unbiblical, unmet expectations that young adults assign to God, and they're like, well, he's not meeting these things, and so he's not being faithful to me?
Well, I think we talked about success a little bit, that I'm going to have the house, the yard, the wife, the 2.5 children, and a dog, right? So I think there's some of that Jesus is going to make life easy and successful. I think also there's this, that nothing bad is ever going to happen, that there's not going to be any twists and turns in my life. There's not going to be any curveballs, right? Because I think sometimes when we are faced with adversity, whether it be through a broken world or even through spiritual warfare and the enemy, right, crossing us up, that if we don't have a gospel worldview, if we don't have this lens, we don't know what to do with that. Of God, I'm being faithful. God, I'm doing everything right here. What's going on? And sometimes that can really, if you don't have a gospel lens, that can mess us up to the point where I think some young believers have deconstructed because they didn't know what to do with the problem of evil or the problem of pain or the broken world in and of itself. And so I can see that, or my life's just not going the way I thought it would, or this didn't turn out the way I thought it would. That's what's happening in Luke 24. God didn't do for me what I thought he was going to do. Now what do I do with God after this? How do I move forward? And so that's where those two disciples were. And so those are some things that I see, but what about you guys? What unmet expectations do you see in the 18 to 40 world?
Yeah, I think especially in the just day and age, the instant gratification, I think that we just expect if it's God's plan, it's going to happen immediately. And the concept of waiting or working or preparing is almost out the window. So for a lot of young adults, the idea of mentorship, as important as discipleship and mentorship is, they almost feel like, well, I don't have time for that because I have to be serving right now. And they don't look at the grand view of their life of, you have 40, 50, 60, hopefully years ahead of you of ministry. You really need to be taking these years of allowing yourself to be poured into by some more mature Christians. But they just have the expectation, well, if God has a ministry for me, he's going to give me the largest platform he can right now. Because of maybe social media influencers or whatever. They want their platform enlarged before their character is ready for that platform to be enlarged. And so it may be actually an answer to prayer that God hasn't moved them farther along because they're not ready for that success yet. Doesn't mean success and answer prayers aren't coming. They're just not ready for it. Yeah. And so just being mindful of that and helping pour into, just because you may not be as far along as you think you should be, it doesn't mean God is not like working and walking with you exactly where you're supposed to be.
I also think amongst that kind of generation 18 to 40, I think there's a real lack of understanding of who God is. And I remember having a conversation with someone, and I think I quoted some scriptures, just you know how we do, we'll quote a scripture flippantly, we'll just say something. And he said, and the response was like, okay, what does that mean? And I remember just thinking like, in that moment I said it, it wasn't like I was trying to preach to him or anything in that moment, but he was just like, but what does that mean for me? Like, what do I tell my daughter? What do I, if this situation comes up, what do I tell? And like me, this individual has spent a lifetime in church, but but the life, and it goes back to what I said before, just kind of the culture of church versus the reality of it. You can spend a lifetime in institution and not really understand the tenets of that thing. And so for me, what I see is, if there's a situation in which these life occurrences happen, somebody passes away, there's a change in the economy, social unrest, whatever's going on, being able to effectively understand God in those settings. And I think that's one of the, if I had to point out something, I think that's one of the main things that a young adult of that space struggles with. It's just like, okay, I've heard, weeping may endure for a night, joy comes in the morning my whole life. Or I've heard this scripture my whole life. I've heard that scripture my whole life. But how do I associate that with this thing that seems so incredibly bad?
Right.
Yeah,
but that's Luke 24, right? So these guys are walking through this. It almost says that they're kind of arguing, right? Because they've just heard about the empty tomb. They're like, man, I don't know. What do you mean? And so they're walking, and then here comes Jesus, and he has almost like concealed himself or made it to where they can't see him. He's caused a blind spot where they cannot perceive him. And he's just like, what are you guys talking about? And they're like, you don't know what we're talking about? And he's the guy that they're talking, right?
Yeah.
But what he does is he says, okay, well, let's look at this now. Let's start from the beginning and all the way through Moses and the prophets. I'm going to walk you through the whole Old Testament.
Yeah.
And I'm going to show you how it all pointed to me.
Wow.
And I think when we can take our lives and our small stories and fit that into the big story of Scripture, right? That meta-narrative. Okay, then our lives make sense because they're in the proper context. Yeah. But I mean, if all you've grown up with are these stories, and unless I'm not anti-moral, right? Don't hear me wrong on that, but if all you've ever heard are these kind of moralistic teachings from Scripture, dare to be a David, or, things like that.
Dare to be a David. That's right.
Then what you miss, though, in that, story, not to, just rip Matt Chandler here, but we are not David, right? We were the guys on the sideline afraid to step into the battle.
Wow.
Jesus was the one who stepped into the place of death and purchased our victory for us. Well, if we can't see ourselves in the big story, then when life does throw the curveballs, or when things do come that we don't have a context for, we don't understand, then it begins to fit. Or when the scriptures that we've heard our entire lives, we actually then they fit, because that's what happened to these guys as well. Is when after Jesus was done teaching, they said, "Man, our hearts burned within us." And I mean, that's our prayer for young adults, that through our teaching, that we are helping them fit the big story and putting all the pieces together. And when that happens, I know for me, that's what I felt. I felt my heart burning within him of like, wait a minute, I have a clarity now. I see the big picture. Yeah. Like, this fits. And then doesn't make life any easier, but now I have a lens to view the world that makes total sense. It gives my life purpose, meaning, and a mission to join and help accomplish.
Yes, sir.
So
I think one of the practical things that we see you able to minister to and through when we come to this clashing of worldview and helping people see through a gospel lens is the Jesus tent that you mentioned at Bonnaroo. And in a second, we'll let you explain to our listeners exactly what that is. But, you probably have something in your community that is a clashing of worldviews. And so hopefully the testimony of Bonnaroo and the Jesus tent will maybe put inside of you the desire to see, okay, how can I have these gospel conversations with people who either have no idea of the gospel, or they have a wrong idea of the gospel, or they know the gospel, but they're running from the gospel.
Yeah.
And so explain to the people a little bit, what is Jesus Tent at Bonnaroo, and kind of how did that come about, and how is it just this opportunity to have a practical strategy of taking the gospel into what would seemingly be a dark environment.
Yeah, so first, Bonnaroo is a music festival in Manchester, Tennessee, and it started back in 2002. And so 80,000 to 100,000 people come to a town of about 12,000 and flood our city. And basically it's just a music festival with just an eclectic blend of bands and artists and everything else. And so it's one of the largest music festivals in the nation.
Side question.
Yeah.
What impact does that have on the city itself?
Well, Manchester has gotten the infrastructure now where they can kind of move people in, and unless you're paying attention or you hear the music at night, we don't even know they're there.
Right.
Unless you go to Walmart, and that is some of the best people watching you will ever encounter.
That's
right. But in the early days, it shut our town down.
Wow.
Because people are coming in from every direction.
Yeah.
And but that's really where the seeds of the Jesus tent were planted.
Okay.
Where right outside our church, there was a traffic jam for miles. And our education director, who is the wife of our pastor, her name's Cindy Cox. Cindy saw the traffic jam and said, "Hey, I've got some popsicles left over from VBS. Let's just go there and see if we can offer water and some popsicles."
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, so seeds of the Jesus tent were planted right there. As Manchester got better at their infrastructure, and nothing against Manchester, they just, what do you do when 80,000 people come in? Yeah. But as Manchester got a better plan and were able to get people in more efficiently, there was no need to be on the roads, the highways and byways passing out water. We found a way to get some private property, some land that was available to us. And so some local pastors, Brent Cox, Kerry Walker, said, let's put a tent out there and let's kind of do the same thing, but let's see if we can have some conversations. So they put a 60 by 40 tent right there in what's called Outer Rue, which is the campgrounds. And so we give away water, lemonade, tea, coffee, all kinds of snacks, maybe toiletry items that they may have forgotten, phone charging stations, and then just shade, table, fans, and a place where people can sit, relax, and possibly have a gospel conversation if they're interested. And so that's essentially the platform of the ministry. And so I came in probably in 2014. They were telling me about what they called the More Than Music ministry. And they said, that's the name of the tent, but the Bonnaroovians call it the Jesus tent.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, well, that's the name, right? So,
perfect.
yeah, so we rebranded, came up with a logo, and from there, we just, and I got to put in the plug, but I really mean it from the bottom of my heart. We are so grateful for the Tennessee Baptist Mission Board partnering with us, Duck River Baptist Association, all the local churches from across 4 different states that come together to make the Jesus tent happen. We could not do this without you.
So what would you say is the average kind of just, because obviously it's a music festival, so I'm sure there's a lot going on and there's a lot to see.
Yeah.
I'm sure. But what would you say is the average kind of attitude of an individual walking in the Jesus tent, maybe for the first time, or that don't, they like, what is this? Like what is their attitude when they see? Because is there a sign that says Jesus tent?
Yeah. There's a massive, we put up a pop tent out front of the tent that has the logo, everything on it.
Yeah.
And then we have a sign that just says everything's free and everything that's inside.
Yeah.
And, the overall attitude is that, man, this is incredible. Why are you doing this? So there's that, like, okay. Like, there's a funny story where 2 girls were afraid to come into the tent because they thought it was a VIP tent and they didn't have credentials to come inside. Yeah. And so when we told them, no, this is for anybody, and everything's free, come on in. But I think the overall theme from the majority of people at Bonnaroo is, I came here for the music. I didn't really come here to meet Jesus, but you guys are out here and you're serving, and this is amazing. And sadly, I think many of them are saying, I wish more Christians were like you. Now, we can do the things we're doing because of all the support and help that we have, but I think that's telling. Yeah. The people without Christ in the community are saying, I wish you were more like this. I'd be interested in talking to you if you were more like this.
I've been to Bonnaroo in the Jesus tent for 2 years now, and I kind of see the Jesus tent as that. I mean, like you said, you know what you're coming to when you come to the Jesus tent. Like More Than Music tent, nothing against the name, but it's kind of generic of what is this exactly. But the Jesus tent, you pretty much know when you're walking in there, you're probably going to be talked to about Jesus. And I feel like it almost is a natural opening for you, because when people come, it's almost like they're expecting you to talk about Jesus. But I kind of also see the Jesus tent as like our space versus their space. Like it's a much different thing than if, you were trying to go into the heart of the music festival and yell at people through bullhorns that they're going to hell or something. While that may be reality that's not effective in that environment. But you're meeting a need, you're showing the love of Jesus, you're giving them maybe the only positive experience they've had with a believer in Jesus. They probably have these expectations of what it looks like to be a Christian or be a Christ follower. A lot of the people that come to Bonnaroo are from other states that may not have as big of a church or gospel presence. And so I think it's awesome when you hear testimonies like that of like, man, thank you. Why are you doing this? I had a person tell me, they used the example, the Jesus tent for me every year is like an island in the middle of the sea that is Bonnaroo. They were like, I feel like I can come here and I know it's a safe place, that I can be around people who care about me. And you could just see, like, while they are frequent goers to this music festival, one thing that they look forward to is this free tent where they get to just hang out with people. And I think that, again, just points back to that desire that we all have that's been created in us to be around like-minded Christ followers. Even if we're not believers, we have that desire to know God and to know the things of God. Yeah. And you just see that in Bonnaroo. And so if you're listening, you may not live in Manchester or the Manchester area. Quick plug, you can volunteer. So contact Jake. He would love to have you out the second week of June. The tent is open for 24 hours from that Thursday to Sunday. And it's easy gospel conversations because, again, people are almost expecting you to have it. But you may have a Jesus tent type event you could do in your own community or surrounding communities. You may have something that the normal residents of your community see as evil or worldly or godless or whatever, and God could put inside of your mind, just like He put in the mind of the people 20 years ago, what if we just gave out some water and popsicles? They probably never thought here 20 years later we would be talking about this ministry that has gospel conversations with up to 20,000. I mean, huge gospel impact. There's really no, and then I think another great testament is, there are people who came to Bonnaroo this year who also volunteered in the tent. They just wanted to give back. And so, I mean, it's an awesome ministry.
Yeah, it is. And, when you look at this, so you look at Bonnaroo, Jesus tent, you might be thinking, okay, that's a big juxtaposition, right? Yeah. But what I would tell you, too, is that you look in the book of Revelation, the church of Laodicea, right? They were neither hot nor cold. They were lukewarm. Cultural Christianity is an antithesis of the gospel. So, like, it may not be a Bonnaroo. It may just be something in your town or your city where it's cultural, right? It's cultural Christianity, or it's just kind of lukewarm. So maybe it's your county fair, right? Or maybe it's just some type of event where it's not good or bad, but it's something where it needs the gospel stepping into
Strawberry Festival or whatever, small town, car shows or whatever it may be that you can just have a gospel presence. Mm-hmm. You outline in the kind of toward the end of the book this strategy. It's like a 7-point, and it's almost like a workflow of like, you're not going to be able to reach discipleship and multiplication if you don't first get a gospel worldview that impacts your gospel fluency and values and living and sharing and all of these different things. So as we kind of wrap up our time together, what are some practical things that, again, churches who may have young adult ministries, but even if they don't, they're just trying to have young adult relationships, how can they help young adults walk through this strategy of just trying to take somebody who has no worldview or a poor worldview of what it means to follow Jesus and the gospel through the strategy? What is kind of the heart behind that?
Well, the heart behind that, number one, is so that you would not assume, right? So be explicit about the gospel in your teaching. Be explicit about where whatever current passage you're teaching through or book, where does that fit in the story? And so really work on how this is what the gospel is, and this is how it's lived out, and this is how it's applied. So evangelism is teaching the gospel to someone who's never heard. Discipleship is applying the gospel to a believer. So to the point to where there's a fluency in the way we teach, so that there will be a fluency in the young adults under our care that we shepherd, to where they'll see the world. And then the hope is, from that fluency, it will affect their values. So they're looking at all of life, and they're seeing the gospel played out in their job, in their marriage, in their parenting, in their relationships. From there, that's going to lead to gospel living, right? And so they want to live out this gospel. And so, in my work life, I'm going to be gracious to my coworkers, or I'm going to have a strong work ethic because it honors God and it's a part of the vocation or the theology of vocation, right? From that living, there should become a sharing. Because it's not hard for me to talk about my wife. I love her. I love talking about my kids. I love them. So you're going to talk about what you love. So if we have the foundation of a worldview, a lens in which we see the world, that's affecting our values and the way we live. It's going to work into our sharing. And we all know that if you're sharing the gospel, right, you're scattering the seed. The Bible tells us that some of that's going to fall on good soil. And there will be a harvest. So from there, you've got that disciple making. And then the more you make disciples, right, the more disciples you have, the more the multiplication begins to happen. And so so often we think about disciple making and multiplication, right, kind of those outward things. But we're not getting to beneath the surface of the iceberg. And so this top part is really that deep work that's going on in our hearts, so that there can be the outward work of disciple making and multiplication. But we really don't get to that unless we first dig in and do the hard work of the first parts of the strategy.
Well, Jake, thank you so much for being with us today. If our listeners want to connect with you, ask you more questions, what's an email maybe they could reach out to or follow you? What are some ways they could connect with you and your ministry?
Email is jdorak.fbc@gmail. You can also find me on Facebook, Jake Dorak, Instagram.
Dorak.
Yeah, that A is so important. Let's keep that A. And then Instagram, it's Dorak Jake. But I'm pretty sure if you Google Jake Dorak, you might see my face on there somewhere and find a way to find me. You can also go to our church website, manchesterfbc.com.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Well, Jake, thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you for listening. If this was your first time listening, make sure to like, share, subscribe. Go back and listen to our other conversations that we've had. Be on the lookout for the future podcast episodes that we're going to drop. Make sure to follow us on social media at Young Adults TN. Right. Again, I'm Ryan Keaton, and we want to give a special shout out to Colby Mike for engineering and producing this. Thank you to our local churches who give through the cooperative program and the Golden Offering for Tennessee Missions, who makes resources like this possible. Until Lorenzo, next time, Lorenzo is the man.
He is the man.
Until next time, go win your harvest field for Jesus.
Yes,
we'll
sir.
see you.
Thanks, guys.